On January 26, 1966, the sun rose over Adelaide with the promise of a sweltering holiday, but it set on a mystery that would dismantle the innocence of an entire nation. This is not merely a story of disappearance, it is a forensic examination of the moment Australia changed forever. Welcome to the timeline of the Beaumont children. The door to 109 Harding Street opened at exactly 10 a.m., releasing 3 children into the oppressive heat of the Somerton Park morning. It was Australia Day, then known as Anniversary Day, and the temperature was already climbing toward a forecasted 40 degrees Celsius. Nancy Beaumont stood in the hallway, the ambient dust motes dancing in the shaft of light cutting through the doorframe. She handed the folded towels to Jane. At 9 years old, Jane was the de facto leader of the trio, a responsibility she wore with the seriousness of a third parent. "Take care of them, Jane," Nancy said. It was a standard instruction worn smooth by repetition. Jane nodded, adjusting the strap of the blue vinyl sports bag on her shoulder. The bag contained the architecture of their afternoon: a towel, swimmers for the boys, and a few small personal items. Nancy pressed coins into Jane's palm, 8 shillings and 6pence. It was enough for the bus fare and a small lunch, a calculated allowance that left no room for extravagance. "Be on the noon bus," Nancy added, her voice firm but not anxious. "If you miss that one, the 2 o'clock is the absolute latest. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mum." Anna, 7, stood by the gate, scuffing the toe of her shoe against the pavement. She was wearing tan shorts. Grant, only 4, was vibrating with the kinetic energy of a toddler, tugging at his own green shorts. Jim Beaumont was already gone, having left hours earlier for a sales trip to Snowtown. The house was quiet behind Nancy. She watched them walk down the street. They did not look back. They turned the corner toward the bus stop on Diagonal Road, 3 figures shrinking in the shimmering heat haze. Nancy closed the door. The latch clicked, a mechanical finality that would echo in her memory for 50 years. The bus ride was a short, rattling journey of 5 minutes. The children disembarked at Moseley Square in Glenelg. The beach was the epicenter of Adelaide's holiday leisure, a sprawling canvas of sand, salt water, and thousands of bodies seeking relief from the sun. To the modern investigator, the environment of Glenelg Beach in 1966 presents a paradox. It was an open, public space with high visibility, yet it lacked the surveillance infrastructure that defines modern policing. There were no CCTV cameras, no digital footprints, no mobile phone triangulation. The investigation that would follow relied entirely on the fallible, malleable resource of human memory. The children dropped their belongings near the Glenelg Surf Lifesaving Club. The timeline here is established through the corroboration of multiple witnesses, though the precise minutes blur. At approximately 11 a.m., the first anomaly entered the frame. An elderly woman, sitting on a bench near the sea wall, observed the 3 children. She noted them because they were interacting with a man. In the decades of case files that would accumulate in the South Australia Police archives, this man would remain a phantom, a composite sketch of shadows. He was described as Caucasian, thin-faced, with fair to light brown hair. He was in his mid-30s, wearing swimming trunks. The witness observed the man lying on his stomach on the sand. The interaction was not aggressive. It appeared familiar. The man was spraying water at the children. The children were laughing. This observation is critical. The Beaumont children, particularly Jane, were raised with a strict code of conduct regarding strangers. They were described by their parents as shy, reserved children who would not engage casually with adults they did not know. The playfulness suggests a pre-existing rapport or a highly effective grooming capability utilized within a very short window. The witness watched for several minutes before turning away. When she looked back, the man and the children had moved. At 12:15 p.m., the timeline solidified around a transaction. The Wenzel's Bakery stood on Moseley Street, a short walk from the foreshore. The shopkeeper knew the Beaumont children well. They were regulars. When Jane approached the counter, the shopkeeper noted the time because of the lunch rush. Jane ordered 2 pasties and a meat pie. "That's for the boys, is it?" the shopkeeper asked, placing the pastries in a paper bag. "Yes," Jane replied. The transaction is the single most significant piece of physical evidence from the first 3 hours. The total cost came to more than the 8 shillings and sixpence Nancy had provided. Furthermore, Jane produced a £1 note to pay for the order. In 1966, a £1 note was a significant denomination for a 9-year-old to carry. Nancy Beaumont would later testify with absolute certainty that she had given Jane only coins. Jane had not left the house with a note. The shopkeeper made the exchange. She watched Jane leave. The provenance of that £1 note remains one of the enduring factual disconnects of the case. It implies a third party. It implies a gift given prior to the lunch purchase. It confirms that between 10:15 a.m. and 12:15 p.m., the children had been in sustained contact with someone who had financial means and the inclination to share them. The children were seen walking away from the bakery, not toward the bus stop, but back toward the beach. At 109 Harding Street, the clock on the kitchen wall ticked past 12:15 p.m. Nancy Beaumont paused in her housework. The noon bus would have arrived at the stop on Diagonal Road by now. It was a short walk from the stop to the house. She waited for the sound of the front gate. She waited for Grant's voice. The silence in the house remained unbroken. Nancy felt a flicker of irritation. They had missed the first bus. It was unlike Jane to be disobedient, but it was a holiday, and the beach was exciting. Nancy rationalized the delay. The 2 p.m. bus was the hard deadline. She returned to her chores, the heat of the afternoon pressing against the windows. By 2 p.m., the irritation had calcified into a low-level anxiety. Nancy sat by the window, watching the street. The bus came. It wheezed to a halt, deposited a few passengers, and pulled away. None of the passengers were her children. The house was too quiet. Nancy moved to the telephone but hesitated. Jim was not home yet. To call the police now would seem hysterical. They were just late. Perhaps they had lost track of time. Perhaps they had missed the bus and were walking. A long trek, but possible. At 3 p.m., the sound of a car engine in the driveway broke the vigil. It was Jim. He had returned early from his trip. He walked through the door, expecting the chaos of 3 children. He found only Nancy, her face pale, her hands gripping the back of a kitchen chair. "They're not back," she said. "They weren't on the 2 o'clock bus." Jim didn't argue. He didn't rationalize. The psychology of the parents in this moment is pivotal. They did not assume the children were misbehaving. They assumed something was wrong. This instinct drives the timeline of the investigation forward faster than in many similar cases. "I'll go to the beach," Jim said. He dropped his keys, then picked them up again immediately. "Stay here. If they walk in, call the police box at Glenelg and leave a message for me." Jim Beaumont drove the short distance to Glenelg with a rising sense of urgency. The beach was beginning to empty as the late afternoon sun lost its bite, but the crowds were still thick enough to offer camouflage. He parked and ran to the changing sheds. He called their names. "Jane! Anna! Grant!" His voice was swallowed by the ambient noise of the surf and the chatter of holidaymakers. He checked the usual spots, the sprinkler where they liked to play, the bench near the club. He stopped a few people. "Have you seen 3 kids? A girl in pink, another in shorts, a little boy?" He received only headshakes. The anonymity of the crowd, which had been a playground hours earlier, was now an obstacle. Jim returned to the car and drove the streets surrounding the foreshore. He scanned the bus stops. He checked the road leading back to Somerton Park. The logic of the situation was disintegrating. If they had missed the bus, they would be walking. If they were walking, he would have seen them. At 5 p.m., Jim Beaumont walked into the Glenelg police station. The station was a bastion of calm, smelling of floor wax and stale tobacco. The officer at the desk looked up. He saw a man in a dress shirt, sweating, eyes wide with a specific breed of panic that police officers learn to recognize. "My children," Jim said. "They haven't come home." The initial police response was standard for the era. The concept of stranger danger was not the cultural reflex it is today. In 1966, missing children were almost always simply lost children. They were at a friend's house. They had fallen asleep under a jetty, They had wandered too far. "How long have they been gone?" the officer asked, pulling a notepad toward him. "Since 10 this morning. They were supposed to be back by 2. The officer noted the time. "They likely lost track of the time, Mr. Beaumont. It's a hot day. Have you checked the reserve?" "I've checked everywhere." "We'll send a patrol car around," the officer said, his tone placating. "Go home. Wait by the phone. 9 times out of 10, they're sitting on the front step when you get back." Jim obeyed, but the dread in his gut was absolute. He knew his children. He knew Jane. She did not deviate from the plan. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across Adelaide. The temperature dropped slightly, but the air remained heavy. At 109 Harding Street, the wait became a physical torture. Nancy and Jim sat in the living room. Every car passing the house caused them to stiffen. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep. By 7 p.m., the lost children theory began to bleed into something dark. The police patrol car had returned to the station. They had swept the beach, the reserve, and the streets. They had found nothing. No blue sports bag, no towel, no discarded clothing. The lead investigator for the night shift at the Glenelg station looked at the report. The absence of the bag was troubling. Children who wander off usually leave their gear behind. Children who drown leave their towels on the sand. A complete disappearance of 3 persons and all their effects suggested a departure that was organized. Or forced. "Get the men back out there," the sergeant ordered. "Check the bins, check the toilets again, knock on doors." The search that night was a frantic, localized effort. Officers with torches combed the sand dunes. They swept the beams of light over the dark water of the Gulf St. Vincent. The ocean was calm, indifferent to the activity on the shore. Back at the house, friends and neighbors had begun to gather. The community network was activated. Men in cars drove the grid of Somerton Park and Glenelg, shouting the names out of open windows. "Jane! Anna! Grant!" The names hung in the humid night air, unanswered. At midnight, the atmosphere in the Beaumont household had shifted from panic to a sterile, cold terror. Nancy was seated on the sofa, clutching a photograph of the children. Jim was pacing the kitchen. The police had escalated the classification. This was no longer a case of children losing track of time. The timeline had stretched too far. The lead investigator arrived at the home shortly after 1 a.m. He removed his hat as he entered. He was a man trained to deal with tragedy, but the sight of the parents, frozen in the amber of their grief, gave him pause. "Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont," he said, his voice level, devoid of false hope. "We have not located them. We have contacted the taxi companies. We are checking the bus depots." "Did someone take them?" Nancy asked. The question was a whisper, but it sucked the oxygen out of the room. "We are keeping an open mind," the investigator said, "but we need recent photos. We need descriptions of exactly what they were wearing, every detail, the color of the buttons, the brand of the shoes." Jim provided the details. He described Jane's pink shorts, Anna's tan shorts, Grant's green shorts. He described the blue bag with the white handles. He described the towel. As he spoke, he was not just a father. He was becoming a witness. He was becoming an advocate. He was forcing the system to see his children not as files, but as flesh and blood. "We will find them," Jim said. It was not a question. It was a demand directed at the universe. The investigator nodded, but his internal calculus was grim. The first 24 hours were ending. In the parlance of modern investigation, the golden hour had long since expired. The trail was cold before they even knew there was a trail. As the sun began to rise on January 27th, the local search was unofficially over. The parameters of the case had shattered the boundaries of Glenelg. The story was leaking out to the newspapers. The headline writers were already drafting the words that would haunt the city. The disappearance of the Beaumont children was no longer a local police matter. It was about to become a national obsession. The innocence of the 26th was gone. The long wait had begun. The morning light did not bring relief. It brought exposure. The sun, rising with the same relentless bleaching intensity as the day before, illuminated the domestic wreckage of the Beaumont home. It revealed the half-drunk cups of tea on the laminate table, the ashtrays overflowing with the grey refuse of Jim's anxiety, and the terrifying stillness of the hallway leading to the children's bedrooms. Nancy moved through the house like a spectre in her own life. She walked to the doorway of the boys' room. The beds were unmade, the sheets thrown back in the haste of yesterday's morning excitement. A toy truck sat askew on the rug. In Jane's room, a book lay open on the nightstand, face down to save the page. These were artifacts of a civilization that had ceased to exist 18 hours ago. They were no longer just possessions, they were evidence. She reached out to touch the doorframe, her fingers trembling. The silence of the house was a physical weight, pressing against her eardrums. Usually, by this hour, the air would be fractured by the sounds of Grant's laughter, the thud of feet, the radio playing. Now, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to be mocking them, marking time in a world where time had stopped. Jim was already on the phone again. His voice was raspy, stripped of its timbre by a night of shouting and smoke. He was speaking to his brother, to neighbours, to anyone who might have a car, a pair of eyes, a theory. He was a man trying to construct a solution out of sheer will, attempting to engineer his children back into existence through logistics. He was saying, his hand gripping the receiver so tight his knuckles were white. He hung up and looked at Nancy. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that didn't involve the one subject they couldn't bear to articulate fully. If they spoke of abduction or murder, they gave those demons power. So they spoke in code, in fragments, in operational directives. Outside, the neighbourhood was waking up to a nightmare. The streets of Somerton Park, usually defined by the sleepy, sun-drenched rhythm of suburban Adelaide, were now charged with a frantic, nervous energy. Neighbours who had slept fitfully were already out on their lawns, peering down the street, hoping to see three small figures trudging home, hand in hand. At the Glenelg police station, the mood was shifting from concern to a hard, crystallized dread. Detective Sergeant John Mitchell sat at his desk, staring at the map of the coastline. The golden hour had passed, yes, but the first 24 hours were still the most critical statistical window. If the children were merely lost, fallen asleep in a dune's hollow, trapped in a shed, injured, they were dehydrated and terrified. If they had been taken, they were likely already miles away. The station was becoming a hive. The telex machines chattered incessantly, spitting out messages from headquarters in Adelaide. The request for additional manpower had been granted. This was going to be the largest search in South Australian history. "Get the cadets," Mitchell barked to a constable. "I want every inch of that foreshore walked, not looked at, walked, shoulder to shoulder. If there is a candy wrapper, I want to know about it. If there is a footprint, I want it cast." By 8 a.m., the beach at Glenelg, usually a playground, had been transformed into a crime scene. The heat was already climbing, the air shimmering off the white sand. A line of police cadets, dressed in their dark, stifling uniforms, formed a human chain. They stretched from the water's edge up to the esplanade. "Step, scan, step, scan." The command was unspoken but understood. They moved with a synchronized, grim determination. They raked through the seaweed. They checked the trash bins. They looked under the pilings of the jetty. The public, realizing the gravity of the situation, began to join in. It was a spontaneous mobilization. Fathers in swim trunks, mothers with sun hats, teenagers on school holiday, they all converged on the beach. But unlike the joyous crowds of Australia Day, this gathering was sombre. There was no shouting, no splashing, just the sound of hundreds of feet shifting in the sand and the relentless crash of the waves, the indifferent ocean that yielded no secrets. Back at the station, the detectives were trying to piece together the timeline. It was a puzzle with missing pieces and edges that didn't fit. They knew the children had taken the bus. They knew they arrived at the beach. Mitchell said, lighting a cigarette and staring at the whiteboard. The first breakthrough, or what seemed like one, came in the form of an elderly woman. At 74, her eyesight wasn't perfect, but her memory was sharp. She sat in the interview room, clutching her handbag, intimidated by the environment, but driven by civic duty. "I saw them," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm sure it was them, near the drinking fountain, about 11 o'clock. "Tell us everything, ma'am," the detective urged gently. "Who were they with?" "They were playing on the grass," she recalled, her eyes drifting to the middle distance, "sprinkling each other with water. But there was a man. He was watching them." The detective's pen paused over his notebook. "A man. Can you describe him?" "He was blonde," she said. "Thin face, sun-tanned. He was lying on the grass nearby. I thought he was with them. He was young, maybe mid-30s. He was wearing swimming trunks, blue, I think." This was the first phantom, the blonde man. In the days and years to come, this figure would grow to mythical proportions. He would become the boogeyman of Australian suburbia. But right now, he was just a lead, a description, a person of interest. "Did you see them talk to him?" "Yes," the woman nodded. "The little girl, the middle one, she went over to him. They were laughing. He seemed friendly, too friendly." Simultaneously, another team of detectives was canvassing the commercial district. They entered Wenzel's Bakery, a popular spot for beachgoers. The smell of yeast and meat pies was heavy in the air, usually a comforting scent, now cloying. The shopkeeper wiped his hands on his apron as the police identified themselves. "Beaumont kids," he said, nodding gravely. "Yeah, I heard on the wireless. Terrible business. Did you see them yesterday?" "I did," the shopkeeper said definitively. "They came in around 12:20. I remember the time because the rush was just starting. They bought pastries and a meat pie." The detective frowned. "A meat pie?" "Yes, and 2 pasties. "How did they pay?" "With a £1 note." The air in the bakery seemed to freeze. The detective looked up from his notepad. "Are you certain? A £1 note?" "Absolutely. I had to give them change. It struck me as odd. Kids that age usually have coins, shillings and pence, not a note." This detail sent a shockwave through the investigation team when it was radioed back to the station. Jim and Nancy had been adamant they had given the children only enough coins for the bus fare and a small treat. 8 shillings and 6pence. That was it. If Grant had a £1 note, it hadn't come from his parents. Mitchell said, the realization settling like lead in his stomach. The implication was sickening. It suggested a predator who had taken his time, who had insinuated himself into their circle, who had perhaps bought them lunch to keep them compliant. The theory suddenly gained terrifying weight. As the afternoon of the 27th wore on, the search radius expanded. The police divers arrived. They were a rugged, silent crew, tasked with the job no one wanted. They geared up at the Patawalonga boat haven, the murky estuary where the river met the sea. Jim Beaumont stood on the bank, watching them. The water was dark, opaque with silt and runoff. Every time a diver surfaced, breaking the water with a gasp of air, Jim's heart hammered against his ribs. He was torn between the desperate hope that they would find nothing and the agonizing fear that they would find everything. Nancy could not watch the water. She remained at the house, which had become a command center for grief. Friends brought casseroles that would go uneaten. The kettle boiled over and over again. The phone rang incessantly, cranks, well-wishers, psychics and reporters. The press had arrived in force. The story had broken the boundaries of local news. It was on the front pages of the Advertiser and the News. The photos Nancy had provided, Jane with her shy smile, Anna looking protective, Grant with his bright, eager eyes, were being printed in ink across the state. They were staring out from newsstands, from television screens, from the collective consciousness of the nation. Reporters camped on the lawn. They were respectful mostly, but their presence was a constant reminder of the spectacle the tragedy was becoming. Flashbulbs popped whenever a police car pulled into the driveway. A reporter shouted from the sidewalk as Nancy briefly appeared at the window. She pulled the curtain shut, her hands shaking. How could she have a message for a monster? She only had a message for her children: come home. By the evening of the 27th, the exhaustion was hallucinatory. Jim and Nancy had been awake for nearly 40 hours. The police finally persuaded them to try to rest, promising to wake them the second there was news. But sleep was a different kind of torture. It was a place where the mind replayed the quote, 71. What if I had gone with them? What if I had said no? What if they missed the bus? In the darkness of the bedroom, Jim whispered, quote, 72. Quote. Nancy replied, though the words felt hollow. In the logic of parenthood, everything is your fault. You are the shield, and the shield had failed. The investigation was now running on two tracks, the physical search and the witness timeline. The timeline was messy. Following the bakery sighting, there was a void. Then came the postman. Tom Patterson, a local carrier, came forward late on the second day. He was a man of routine, his day governed by the clock and the route. Quote 74, he told the detectives. Quote 75. Quote 76. This threw everything into chaos. If the postman was right, the children had left the beach. They were heading home. They had escaped that they were safe. But they never arrived. Mitchell argued with his team. A junior detective suggested. Mitchell countered. The conflicting sightings created a kaleidoscope of possibilities. Were they taken at the beach? Were they taken on the walk home? Did they get into a car voluntarily? The police decided to bring in the sketch artist. Based on the descriptions from the elderly woman and a few others who had noticed a man in the vicinity, they began to compose a face. The pencil scratched against the paper. High cheekbones, thin nose, hair swept back, sun-bleached. A young man, fit, athletic, a surfer type. The face that emerged was chillingly generic. It looked like half the men on Glenelg Beach that day. It was the face of the Australian summer. As the sketch was finalised, prepared for release to the newspapers, the gravity of the manhunt deepened. They weren't looking for a ghost anymore. They were looking for a suspect. Friday, January 28th, the third day. The hope of finding the children alive began to curdle. Statistically, the odds plummeted with every passing hour. The search area was widened to include the Adelaide hills. Mounted police were deployed, their horses stepping carefully through the scrub and brush of the escarpments overlooking the city. The search at the Patawalonga had yielded nothing but old tyres and debris. The divers packed up their gear, their faces grim. The lack of bodies was good news, theoretically, but in a missing persons case, the lack of evidence is its own kind of torment. It leaves the door open to every horrific possibility. The public anxiety was morphing into hysteria. Parents across Adelaide were locking their doors. Children were forbidden from playing in the front yard. The freedom of the suburbs, that unspoken contract of safety that defined the era, had been breached. The Beaumont children had taken the innocence of a generation with them. In the Beaumont house, the atmosphere had become almost liturgical. The parents sat in the living room, surrounded by family. The waiting had become a physical posture. Nancy held Jane's favourite doll, her fingers tracing the plastic features. "We have to appeal to the public," the police commissioner advised Jim. "We need to put you on television. If the person has them, seeing you might trigger something, remorse, or maybe someone watching will realise they know something." Jim agreed. He would have walked through fire. He would do anything. The television crew set up in the living room. The lights were hot, invasive. The camera lens looked like a black eye staring back at him. Jim sat on the sofa, Nancy beside him. She looked shattered, her eyes dark hollows of sleeplessness. Jim leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "We just want them back," Jim said, his voice breaking on the transmission that would be beamed into living rooms across the country. "Jane, Anna, Grant, if you can hear me, Mummy and Daddy are waiting. We are waiting for you." He looked directly into the lens. "And to the person who has them, please, they are just children. They are little children. Bring them home. Leave them somewhere safe. Just let us have them back." The broadcast rippled through the nation. It was raw, unpolished, and devastating. It brought the tragedy out of the abstract and into the hearts of millions. People wept in their living rooms. Switchboards at police stations lit up across the continent. "I saw a car. I saw a man. I heard a scream." The tips flooded in, thousands of them. Most were well-meaning but useless, hallucinations born of empathy. But the police had to check them all. Every white sedan, every blonde man, every freshly dug patch of earth in a backyard. One tip, however, stood out. A woman reported seeing a man walking with 3 children near the Collinggrove homestead, miles away, later in the evening of the 26th. She said the man was carrying the little boy. The boy was asleep, his head on the man's shoulder. Quote 94, the detective demanded, frustration leaking into his voice. Quote 95, she sobbed. This sighting reinforced the grooming theory. If the children were with the man voluntarily hours later, he had completely won their confidence. He had become their guardian. It was a terrifying thought that the children might not have known they were in danger until it was far too late. The weekend arrived, and with it, a new wave of searchers. The Royal Australian Navy was called in. A minesweeper scoured the coastline, using sonar to check the seabed. Helicopters chopped the air overhead, their shadows flitting across the water like giant insects. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, but the result was always the same: silence, the heat, the wind. Nancy began to have dreams, vivid, terrifying flashes. She dreamt of them in a pit. She dreamt of them on a boat. She woke up screaming, the sound tearing through the quiet house, leaving Jim helpless to comfort her. Quote 97, she would whisper, clutching his arm in the dark. The psychological strain was beginning to fracture the reality of the home. They were living in a suspended state, neither parents nor childless, caught in the purgatory of the... On Monday, a new element entered the fray. The mail arrived. Amongst the sympathy cards and the bills, there was a letter. No return address. The handwriting was jagged, erratic. Jim opened it, his hands trembling. "I know where they are," the note read. "They are safe, for now." The police seized the letter immediately. Forensics dusted it for prints. Psychologists analyzed the syntax. Was it the abductor? A hoaxer? A cruel prankster? The lead investigator warned Jim. But Jim couldn't dismiss it. What if it's him? What if he wants a ransom? If it's a ransom, there will be demands. We wait. So they waited. They waited by the phone. They waited for the mail. They waited for the sun to rise and the sun to set. The days turned into a week. The sharp, adrenaline-fueled panic of the first 48 hours settled into a dull, aching, chronic pain. The search teams began to scale back. The volunteers returned to their jobs. The newspapers moved the story from the headline to the lower fold, then to page 3. But the mystery was deepening. The blonde man remained a ghost. The £1 note remained an anomaly. The postman's sighting remained a contradiction. It was in this vacuum of evidence that the supernatural began to creep in. Desperation opens the door to the irrational. Letters began arriving from clairvoyants. They saw visions of water, of sheds, of brick kilns. One name kept coming up in the press and the letters: Gerard Croiset, the famous Dutch parapsychologist. He had solved cases in Europe, they said. He could see across oceans. "We need to bring him here," a family friend urged Jim. "What have you got to lose?" Jim looked at the police, who shook their heads skeptically. But Jim looked at Nancy. She was fading away, day by day, her eyes fixed on a horizon that wasn't there. Jim said, "The entry of the psychic marked a shift in the saga. It was an admission that logic had failed, science had failed, policing had failed. They were now turning to the mystics." But before Croiset arrived, there was the matter of the tip came in about a construction site nearby. A factory was being built. A concrete slab had been poured on the afternoon of the 27th. The detective said, looking at the Croiset plans, "It was a gruesome trivel. It was murdered of the class. He was noli trosly involved in Serge of the chat. In the fact, it became a focal point." Jim Beaumont stood by the chain-link fence of the construction site, staring at the fresh, grey expanse of concrete. It looked impenetrable. It looked final. He said. The officer said gently. Jim shouted, his composure finally snapping. He grabbed the mesh of the fence, shaking it, screaming at the concrete, screaming at the sky. It took 2 officers to hold him back, to walk him away, a broken man sobbing in the dust of a building site. The police did not dig up the slab. Not then. It would remain another question mark, another location on the map of sorrow that Adelaide was becoming. As February began, The summer heat broke, replaced by a cool change that swept in from the ocean. Rain fell on Glenelg Beach, washing away the footprints of the searchers, smoothing the sand back to a pristine, blank canvas. The Beaumont house was quiet. The crowds had thinned. The reporters sat in their cars, smoking, waiting for a break that wasn't coming. Inside, Nancy sat in the boys' room. She picked up the toy truck from the rug. She placed it on the shelf. She smoothed the sheets on the bed. She was preserving the shrine. She walked to the window and looked out at the rain. Somewhere out there, beyond the veil of the storm, Jane, Anna, and Grant were somewhere. She closed her eyes and tried to summon their faces, to keep them sharp in her mind, to prevent the erosion of memory. She saw Jane's smile, Anna's watchful eyes, Grant's cheeky grin. She whispered to the glass. The investigation was far from over. In fact, it would span decades. It would ruin careers, haunt detectives, and torment the family for the rest of their lives. But the initial explosion was over. The shockwave had passed, leaving behind a crater in the soul of the country. The Beaumont children had not just disappeared, they had become a permanent absence. They were the empty chairs at the dinner table of Australia. And as the rain streaked the window like tears, the long, silent vigil continued. The phone sat on the hook, black and silent, a lifeline to nowhere. The photos on the mantelpiece watched the room, frozen in time, forever young, forever waiting for the day that would never end. Jim walked into the room and placed a hand on Nancy's shoulder. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a fellow sentry in the watchtower. They stood together, looking out into the grey afternoon, two parents alone in a house that was too big, too quiet, and too full of ghosts. The search would go on, the questions would echo. But in the quiet of that room, they both knew the terrifying truth that the lead investigator had known on the first night. The world had changed. The sun would rise again tomorrow, but it would never shine quite as brightly as it did before the 26th of January, 1966. The amber had hardened, the story was now legend, and the children were gone. Detective Sergeant Stanley Swain placed the composite sketch on the laminate table, smoothing the edges where the paper had begun to curl. It was late morning, 1967. The air in the incident room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee, but Swain's focus was entirely on the face staring back at him. It was a face constructed from fragments. A high forehead, described by the elderly witness on the bench. A thin, angular jawline, mentioned by the postman. Short, sun-bleached blonde hair detailed by the surfers. It was the face of the man seen with Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont at the Glenelg foreshore. Yet it was also no one. It was an average of memories, a statistical probability rather than a photograph. "We have 3 new sightings from the Alice Springs alert," Constable Miller said, placing a typed report next to the sketch. "Truck driver says he saw 3 kids matching the description near a roadhouse. Said the girl was wearing a pink swimsuit." Swain picked up a red pen. Jane was wearing a pink swimsuit. Anna was in a one-piece with stripes. Grant in green shorts. Did the driver mention a man? "No man, just kids." Swain drew a line through the report. "Grant is 4 years old. He doesn't walk to the Northern Territory alone, and Jane wouldn't leave him. File it under unsubstantiated, remote." This was the grind. This was the reality of the investigation 1 year in. The adrenaline of the initial search, the divers in the Patawalonga, the line sweeps through the sand dunes, had evaporated. What remained was a mountain of administrative attrition. The South Australia police were no longer hunting a hot trail. They were sieving an ocean of well-meaning hysteria. Swain turned back to the composite. The suspect was described as being in his mid-30s, thin-build, wearing blue swimming trunks. Beside him, in the witness accounts, was the blue sports bag. A standard airline bag, navy blue with white piping. Thousands of them had been sold in Adelaide that summer. "The bag," Swain murmured. "It's the only object that doesn't belong to the children." He walked to the large corkboard map of the Glenelg Collie Reserve area. A pin marked the Wenzel's Bakery on Moseley Street. "Go over the bakery receipt again," Swain ordered, not looking back at Miller. Miller flipped through a ledger. 12:20 p.m. Jane buys a meat pie and a pasty. She pays with a £1 note. The shopkeeper knows the children. They've been there before, but they've never used a pound note. The mother, Nancy, confirmed she gave them coins, shillings and pence, only enough for the bus and a small treat.
So the man gave them the money, Swain said, tracing the route from the beach to the bakery with his finger. He gives them £1. It's a lot of money for a child. He sends them to buy lunch. Why? To gain trust? Or to get them away from the water so he can move them? Or he was hungry, Miller suggested. He didn't eat the pie. The witnesses saw the kids eating on the grass. The man was just watching. Swain tapped the pin. This transaction is the anchor. It proves they were alive and in contact with the suspect at 12:20. It proves the suspect had financial means and was grooming them. It changes the profile from impulsive opportunity to calculated seduction. Swain turned to the window. The Adelaide sun was bright, mocking the darkness of the file. We aren't looking for a monster with claws, Miller. We're looking for a man with a pound note and a soft voice. The quiet rigour of the police station stood in stark contrast to the chaos descending upon the Beaumont home on Harding Street. It was November, nearly 2 years since the disappearance, and the desperation of the public had summoned a new kind of investigator. Jim Beaumont stood on his front porch, his arms crossed tight against his chest. He watched the car pull up. Out stepped a man who looked nothing like a detective. Gerard Croiset, the Dutch parapsychologist, had arrived in Australia with the fanfare of a visiting dignitary. The media crushed against the fence line, flashbulbs popping in the daylight. Nancy stood in the doorway behind Jim. She was wearing a simple house dress, her face pale, her eyes scanning the crowd not for the cameras, but for the faces of her children, as if the sheer energy of the event might conjure them. "Is this right, Jim?" she whispered. "The police," Mr. Swain said. "Swain has nothing," Jim said, his voice low and hard.
"He has files, he has sketches. He doesn't have them. If this man can see something, if he can feel something—" Jim walked down the steps to shake Croiset's hand. The Dutchman was intense, theatrical. He held up a hand to silence the reporters, then turned his gaze toward the southwest. "I have a vision," Croiset proclaimed, his English accented and heavy. "I see a warehouse, new building, brick. I see, underneath." The investigation shifted gears violently. The calm elimination of leads in the incident room was replaced by a frenzied excavation. Croiset directed authorities to a warehouse site in the suburb of North Plympton. He claimed the bodies were buried in the concrete footings. For 3 days, the state held its breath. Jim stood at the perimeter of the warehouse site every day. He watched the jackhammers tear into the concrete. The noise was deafening, a violent industrial assault on the earth. Dust coated Jim's suit. He didn't move. He needed to be the witness. If his children were there, he would be the first to welcome them back to the light. The lead investigator, Swain, stood 10 yards away. He wasn't looking at the hole, he was looking at Jim. Swain knew the timeline of the building's construction. He knew the concrete had been poured after the children vanished. But the public pressure was a tidal wave. Logic could not stand against the hope of a miracle. The jackhammers stopped. A silence fell over the site, heavier than the noise. The workers cleared the rubble. They dug into the soil beneath. Nothing. Just dirt, stones, roots. Jim felt the collapse inside his chest, a physical implosion of hope. He saw the workers shake their heads. He saw Croiset gesturing, trying to realign his vision, moving the goalposts of his psychic sight. Swain walked over to Jim. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't offer a platitude. He simply stood beside the father, creating a barrier between Jim and the encroaching press. Quote 141, Swain said quietly. Quote 142. Jim nodded, unable to speak. The solution had failed. The amber remained hard. 1968 brought a cruelty that made the silence seem merciful. The letter arrived in the mail, postmarked from Dandenong, Victoria. It was handwritten. It did not rant. It did not ramble. It was composed with a chilling rationality. "I have the children," it read. "They are well. I will return them." Nancy sat at the kitchen table, the letter shaking in her hands. The handwriting was neat. The author claimed to be the, quote, 144 of the children. He demanded no money initially, only that the parents accept his terms. Nancy said, her voice cracking. Jim read the letter over her shoulder. It was specific. It mentioned details about the children's personalities. It was the lifeline they had been praying for. The police mobilized with a renewed intensity. This wasn't a psychic vision. This was physical evidence, a document, a communication. Swain set up the operation. The letter writer demanded a meeting. Jim was to drive to a specific location, a designated spot in the countryside, to receive further instructions. "We will be everywhere," Swain told Jim as they prepared the car. "We will have men in the scrub. We will have cars on the perimeter. You just drive. You do exactly what he says." Jim drove. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. In the back of his mind, he rehearsed what he would say. "Thank you. Just give them to me."
"I won't hurt you. Just give them to me." He arrived at the location. The wind blew through the dry grass. The sun beat down on the hood of the car. He waited. An hour passed. 2. The shadows lengthened. The birds settled for the evening. No car approached. No figure emerged from the trees. Jim stepped out of the car, standing in the middle of the empty road. He screamed at the horizon. The silence of the Australian bush was the only answer. Back at headquarters, Swain and the forensic team analysed the subsequent letters that arrived. They compared the handwriting to the thousands of samples they had collected from known offenders. They analysed the paper stock, the ink. Quote 152, the forensic analyst said, looking up from his microscope. Swain had to deliver the news. He drove to Harding Street. He sat in the lounge room where the photos of the children watched from the mantelpiece. Swain said, "Nancy didn't cry this time. She went rigid." "How can you be sure?" "Because he asked for nothing that proves life," Swain said gently. "And he didn't show. A man with a prize like that, he doesn't play hide and seek with the handover unless he has nothing to hand over." The cruelty of the hoax solidified something in Nancy. She stood up and walked to the boys' room. She straightened the bedspread on Grant's bed. She picked up a folded shirt and pressed it to her face, inhaling the fading scent of a 4-year-old boy. She said to the empty hallway. She became the keeper of the shrine. While Jim fought the external battle with the police and the press, Nancy fought the internal battle against the erosion of time. She ensured the house remained a frozen coordinate in 1966, a lighthouse that never dimmed, even as the ships stopped passing. The 1970s arrived, bringing with them a change in the texture of the investigation. The urgency of the hunt was replaced by the weight of the archive. The lead investigator, now a senior detective, his hair greying at the temples, sat in the basement of the police headquarters. The room was lined with filing cabinets, floor to ceiling. Each drawer was a tomb of information. The Beaumont file had grown into a monster. It was no longer a single folder, it was a wall. He pulled a box marked Sightings, 1969 to 1974. He read aloud to himself. He pulled the follow-up report attached to it. 2 detectives had driven 16 hours. They had found the girl. She was the daughter of the station cook. She was German. He moved to the next. Follow-up. The boy was identified, a local resident. The investigator rubbed his eyes. The problem wasn't a lack of information. It was an excess of noise. The entire country was looking for them, which meant the country saw them everywhere. Every blonde child, every trio of siblings, became a ghost sighting. He stood up and walked to the evidence table, where the blue sports bag file lay open. This was the one detail that gnawed at him. Witnesses at the beach had been adamant. The man had a blue bag. But no bag was ever found. No bag was found at the Beaumont house that was missing. If the bag belonged to the man, the investigator mused, it contained his tools, towels, clothes, or chloroform. He picked up the summary of the Cloncurry search. A station owner in Queensland had reported digging near a sinkhole and finding children's clothing. Sapol had sent a team. They had excavated tons of earth. They found animal bones and old rags. The emotional toll of these false leads was quantifiable in the decline of the parents. Jim was looking thinner, his face drawn. He had taken to writing letters to the police commissioner, demanding updates, demanding new strategies. He was terrified that the file was collecting dust. 168 injector, the investigator, had told him during their last meeting. 169. The investigator looked at the technological limitations of his era. He had a telephone. He had a telex machine. He had paper files. He had fingerprints, if he had a suspect to match them against. But he had no DNA. He had no digital surveillance. He was trying to solve a puzzle in the dark, wearing mittens. He picked up the photo of the children again, the studio portrait. They looked so clean, so prepared for a future that had been stolen. He asked the paper. He realized then that the specific details, the pie, the pound note, the bag, were all he had. The witnesses were aging, memory was malleable. The quote 172 was becoming a myth, his features blurring with every passing year. The only way to solve this was to find the one piece of physical evidence that time couldn't alter. But there was no crime scene. By the mid-1980s, the world had truly moved on. The Vietnam War had ended. Governments had changed. The cars were different. The fashion was different. But in the Beaumont house, the clock was still ticking on 1966 time. Jim sat in the living room. The television was on, showing a news report about the launch of National Missing Persons Week. It was a new initiative, a systemic recognition that people didn't just vanish, they left holes in the fabric of society. The reporter spoke about new computer databases being implemented by police forces across Australia. The phrase, quote, 173, quote, was starting to be used formally. Jim looked at Nancy. She was knitting, her hands moving with a repetitive, soothing rhythm. She didn't look up at the TV. They're starting a special unit, Jim said, dedicated to cases like ours. Not just active investigations, but the old ones, the unsolved. Nancy paused. Will they dig again? If they have to, but this is different. They're going to put the files into computers, cross-reference them with other states. Maybe the man who took them did it again, somewhere else. Maybe he's in a jail in New South Wales for something else. This was the shift. For 2 decades, the investigation had been local, focused on Adelaide, focused on the sand dunes, but the realization was dawning that the predator was likely migratory. At the South Australia Police Headquarters, the transition was physical. The old metal filing cabinets were being moved. Boxes were being unpacked by a new generation of detectives, young men and women who had been children themselves when the Beaumonts vanished. The new lead detective of the Major Crime Investigation Branch picked up the Beaumont binder. It was tattered, the spine taped and retaped. He opened it. He saw the name Harry Phipps, scribbled in a margin note from years ago, dismissed at the time. He saw the name Bevan Spencer von Einem, a predator currently under suspicion for other crimes. We need to re-interview everyone, the new detective said to his team. We don't rely on the old statements. We assume nothing. Some of the witnesses are dead, boss, a young constable noted. Then we interview their children. We interview the neighbours. We look at the bakery again. We look at the money. He tapped the desk. The 1960s methods are dead. We can't door-knock our way out of this. We need forensic linkages. We need to find a connection between a suspect and that location that isn't based on a memory of a face. He looked at the timeline on the wall. 1966 to 1986, 20 years. The parents are still waiting, he said, the weight of the legacy pressing down on him. They haven't changed the phone number. They haven't moved house. The detective closed the folder. The room hummed with the sound of early computer terminals booting up. The amber was about to be examined under a microscope. Traditional investigation has taken us as far as it can, he announced. We have hit the wall. Now we have to dismantle the wall, brick by brick. We aren't looking for a man anymore. We are looking for a pattern. The rain began to fall outside, just as it had on that first night, washing the streets of Adelaide, but failing to wash away the stain of the mystery. The chapter of the immediate search was closed. The era of the cold case had begun. The rain drummed against the reinforced glass of the Major Crime Office, a rhythmic, weeping percussion that seemed to harmonize with the sudden, stifling silence inside. The detective, Detective Sergeant Vance,
remained standing by the window for a long moment, watching the city of Adelaide blur behind the rivulets of water. It was a city that had grown taller, harder, and more cynical since that sweltering Australia day in 1966. But in the reflection of the glass, Vance saw that the shadows remained exactly the same length. He turned back to the room. It was a space caught in a temporal flux, a purgatory between the analog past and the digital future. On one side, the walls were lined with the metal monoliths of the filing cabinets, their drawers slightly agape, exhaling the scent of decaying paper, old tobacco smoke trapped in fibers, and the musty, sweet odor of archival glue. On the other side, the new workstations sat like intruders, beige monoliths with heavy cathode ray tube monitors that emitted a high-pitched, almost imperceptible whine, the sound of the new age. "Right," Vance said, his voice grating against the hum of the cooling fans. "Let's feed the machine." The process was not the swift, cinematic revolution the brass upstairs had promised. It was surgical, tedious, and grueling. Young Constable Miller, a man whose sideburns were trimmed to the sharp fashion of the 80s, sat before the first terminal. He looked at the stack of documents Vance placed beside him with a mixture of reverence and dread. These weren't just reports. They were the holy scriptures of South Australia's greatest trauma. Miller muttered, the clack of the mechanical keyboard sounding like gunfire in the quiet room. Vance instructed, pulling up a chair that groaned under his weight. Vance opened the Phipps file again. He lit a cigarette, ignoring the new no smoking signs that had begun to sprout up in government buildings. The smoke curled blue and thick around the desk lamp. Harry Phipps. The name felt heavy in his mouth, like a stone. Vance ran a finger over the handwritten notes from a detective long retired, a man who had likely drunk himself into oblivion years ago, trying to forget the faces of Jane, Anna, and Grant. The note was sparse. Subject interviewed, upstanding member of the community, factory owner, no probable cause to search premises. Vance whispered, the word tasting like bile. He looked at the timeline pinned to the corkboard. 1966. The innocence of the era was the killer's greatest accomplice. In 66, you didn't question a gentleman in a suit. You didn't suspect the wealthy industrialist who handed out sweets. You looked for the swagman, the drifter, the other. Vance said, not looking up. Miller said, his eyes fixed on the green cursor blinking hypnotically against the black screen. Vance replied grimly. 5 miles away, the rain was falling on the roof of the house in Somerton Park. It was a sound that Nancy Beaumont had learned to live with, a part of the house's respiratory system, distinct from the creaking of the floorboards or the hum of the refrigerator. The house was a capsule. To the casual observer, it was simply a tidy, well-maintained suburban home. But to those who knew, to those who felt the gravity of the place, it was a museum of suspended animation. Nancy sat in the armchair, a book resting unread in her lap. The silence here was different from the silence at police headquarters. It wasn't the silence of concentration, it was the silence of absence. It was a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. She looked toward the hallway. The door to the children's room was closed, as it usually was. It wasn't locked, never locked, but it was closed to keep the dust out, to keep the air still. Inside, she knew the geography of that room better than the lines on her own palm. The folded bedspreads, the specific angle of the toys, the clothes that would now fit toddlers, ghosts of the bodies that had grown, or should have grown, into adults. Grant would be 24 now, a man, Jane almost 30. The thought was a sharp, jagged thing that she had to carefully navigate around, like broken glass on the floor. If she dwelled on the ages they should be, the madness would come creeping in from the corners of the room. She had to remember them as they were. 7, 9, 4, frozen in amber. The phone sat on the side table, a heavy, rotary dial piece of black bakelite. It was the altar at which they had prayed for 2 decades. Every ring was a jolt of electricity to the heart. Every wrong number was a tragedy. But they could never change it. They could never move. What if they come back? The question was a loop tape in her mind. What if they escape, 20 years later, and they try to call, and a stranger answers? Jim came in from the back garden, shaking the rain off his coat. He looked older. The years had eroded him, carved deep channels into his face, stooped his shoulders. He carried the burden differently than she did. He carried it in his silence, in the way he endlessly fixed things that weren't broken, painting fences that didn't need paint, weeding garden beds that were already pristine. Activity was his anesthetic. He said softly. Nancy replied. Jim said, hanging his coat on the rack. Nancy sighed, a sound of infinite weariness. The anniversary was coming. The media was a beast that woke up once a year to feed on their grief, to splash the photos of the children across the papers again, to speculate, to reopen the wounds, and then to hibernate for another 12 months. Nancy said. Jim walked to the window, peering out through the lace curtains at the grey street. He trailed off. Jim whispered. Back at headquarters, Vance was realizing the magnitude of the geography Jim Beaumont feared. He had spread a large topographical map of South Australia across 2 pushed-together desks. It was a chaotic tapestry of contour lines, coastal roads, scrubland, and urban sprawl. Vance announced to the room. The team, 3 other detectives and the administrative staff, stopped their work. Vance said, tracing the coastline of Glenelg with a nicotine-stained finger. He moved his finger inland. His finger drifted north toward the vast, empty expanses of the scrub, and then south toward the jagged cliffs and deep ravines of the Fleurieu Peninsula. A detective named Harrison piped up. Harrison was older, a veteran of the Truro murders investigation. Vance nodded. He walked over to the whiteboard where the name Bevan Spencer von Einem was written in red marker. Below it, Vance wrote, The Unseen Network. Vance said, addressing the room with a newfound intensity. He picked up the binder labelled Castry. Another name, another shadow. Vance commanded. Miller looked up from the computer screen, his face pale in the green light. Vance moved to the terminal instantly, leaning over the young constable's shoulder. Miller said, pointing to the glowing text. Vance mused. Miller tapped the key, scrolling down. The room seemed to drop a few degrees in temperature. The connection was tenuous, a spiderweb in a hurricane, but it was there, a thread linking the disappearance of the children to the grotesque network of paedophilia and murder that had been uncovered in the late 70s. Vance ordered. The investigation moved from the frantic energy of the chase to the slow, grinding pressure of geology. Days turned into weeks. The rain stopped, replaced by the dry, baking heat of the South Australian summer, the same heat that had baked the sand on that Australia day. Vance found himself driving to Glenelg often, not to interview, but to stand. He would park his unmarked Commodore on the esplanade and walk down to the water's edge. He tried to see the beach not as it was now, with its modern bikinis and transistor radios playing synthesized pop, but as it was then. He closed his eyes, filtering out the noise. He tried to summon the ghosts. The 3 figures, Jane with her book, the striped towel, the tall blonde man. Trust, Vance thought. That was the weapon. The children were shy. Nancy had said so 1,000 times. They wouldn't go with a stranger, unless the stranger didn't seem strange. Unless the stranger seemed like authority, or safety, or fun. He walked toward the shower block. The architecture had changed, but the footprint was the same. He imagined the man watching, calculating. A chilling thought struck Vance, one that the 1960s detectives had been too polite to entertain. What if they had been groomed? Not that day, but weeks before. Vance hurried back to his car, his mind racing. The investigation had always assumed the abduction was a singular event, a lightning strike. But what if the predator had been stalking them? What if he had met them before, bought them an ice cream a week prior, established a rapport? He drove back to the city, the tires humming on the hot asphalt. He needed to talk to the school friends again. The children who were now 30-year-olds
with mortgages and children of their own. Did Jane ever mention a new friend? Did Grant talk about a man with a nice car? The questions had been asked in 1966, but they had been asked by men looking for a kidnapper. Vance needed to ask them like a man looking for a seducer. The interview room was different now, softer, less intimidating. Vance sat across from a woman named Sarah, who had been Jane Beaumont's best friend in 3rd grade. Sarah was nervous, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. She said, her voice trembling. Vance said gently. He opened his notepad. Sarah frowned, looking up at the ceiling fans spinning lazily. Sarah paused. The silence stretched. Her eyes narrowed as she reached back across the chasm of 2 decades. Sarah said slowly. Vance leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sarah's face paled. Vance wrote the phrase down, underlining it twice. Too pretty to be poor. It was a line of dialogue from a script of manipulation. It wasn't the language of a random snatch and grab. It was the language of a relationship. Did she say where she met him? No, Sarah whispered, but she was happy. She wasn't scared. That's the worst part, isn't it? She wasn't scared. Vance closed the notebook. Thank you, Sarah. You've been very helpful. He walked out of the interview room and straight into the bullpen. The energy had shifted again. The lethargy of the cold case was gone, replaced by the sharp scent of a lead. We need to look at the money, Vance announced to the room. Forget the eyewitnesses at the beach for a moment. We look for a source of income. Who was giving shillings to children in Somerton Park in December 65 and January 66? We look at the local shops. Who was flashing cash? We look for the grooming phase. Miller looked up. Boss, if that's true, if he was buying them, then he was local, truly local. He wasn't migratory. He was right there in the neighborhood. Exactly, Vance said. He was hidden in plain sight, camouflaged by familiarity. He walked over to the map and drew a tight red circle around the Beaumont home, a radius of only 1 mile. He's in here, Vance said, tapping the center of the circle. Or he was. And if he was this close, and he wasn't caught, then he had protection, or he was someone nobody would ever suspect. He looked at the file of Harry Phipps again, the factory owner, the man with the money, the man who lived within the radius. Get the shovel, Vance said, a metaphorical command that felt dangerously close to literal. We're going to dig into Mr. Phipps's life until his ghost screams. The era of the cold case had begun, but the temperature was rising. The computers hummed, the data compiled, and slowly, pixel by pixel, a picture was beginning to form out of the static of the past. It was a picture of a monster in a tailored suit, smiling, holding out a hand filled with silver coins. And somewhere, beneath the earth of South Australia, the truth lay waiting, composed of calcium and silence, waiting for the technology of the living to catch up with the crimes of the dead. The excavator bucket curled inward, scraping through the compacted layer of clay and limestone at the Newell Avenue site. It was February 2nd, 2018. Detective Superintendent Des Bray stood on the perimeter of the excavation zone, his arms crossed over a high-visibility vest. He watched the heavy machinery dissect the backyard of the property once owned by Harry Phipps. This was not a hunch, this was a calculation. It was the result of geophysical anomalies detected by ground-penetrating radar, disturbances in the soil density that roughly matched the dimensions of a small burial site. "Hold it!" the forensic anthropologist called out. The machine hissed to a halt. The operator killed the engine. The silence that descended on the North Plimpton industrial site was heavy, magnified by the ring of media vans parked just outside the cordon tape. Bray stepped forward, ducking under the caution tape. He moved with the practiced economy of a man who had done this hundreds of times, though never for a case of this magnitude. He crouched beside the anthropologist in the pit. The soil was distinctively disturbed, a mixture of rubbish and fill. "Animal bone," the anthropologist said, brushing away dirt from a fragment with a trowel. "Cow, likely. Domestic refuse." Bray stared at the fragment. He didn't sigh. He didn't swear. He simply catalogued the data point. "Check the rest of the anomaly. Screen everything." For 5 decades, the
the investigation had operated on a pendulum swing between hope and devastation. This excavation was the physical manifestation of the latest swing. The site had been identified based on the memories of two brothers who claimed they had been paid by Phipps to dig a hole here as children on a weekend that aligned with Australia Day, 1966. The timeline fit. The geography fit. Newell Avenue was within the critical radius Vance had drawn on the map years prior. But fit was not fact.
"We have to be sure," Bray said, straightening up. "We don't leave until we hit undisturbed geological bedrock. If they are here, we find them. If they aren't, we close this door for the family." The family was a singular entity in the briefing notes, but in reality, it was two distinct, aging individuals living in the shadow of a national trauma. Jim and Nancy Beaumont. They were no longer the young couple clinging to each other on a Glenelg lawn. They were separated by time and grief, yet bound by the same waiting game. Jim Beaumont sat in his living room, the blinds drawn against the harsh afternoon sun. The phone sat on the side table, a landline that had been the center of his universe for 52 years. He did not watch the live news coverage of the excavation. He had learned decades ago that speculation was a corrosive acid. He looked at the small framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Jane, Anna, Grant. The image was static, frozen in the amber of 1966. But Jim had aged. His hair was white, his movements slower, but his resolve had calcified into something harder than hope. It was duty. In the early years, the duty had been active. He had walked the beaches. He had driven the streets of Adelaide looking for a blue sports bag, for a tall man with blonde hair. He had listened to the clairvoyants who descended on South Australia like vultures, offering visions in exchange for attention. He had read the cruel letters sent in 1968, the hoax that had twisted the knife in their wounds, promising the children's return for money, only to leave them standing at a designated meeting spot, waiting for a car that never came. Now, the duty was administrative. It was about pressure. Jim picked up the notepad next to the phone. He wrote down the date and the name of the liaison officer who had called him that morning. Det Sergeant L. Update 10 a.m. Excavation ongoing. No findings. He kept the records because the state had a short memory. Governments changed, police commissioners retired, files were digitized and archived. But a father's memory was continuous. He had forced himself to remain visible to the police, if not the public. He demanded that the file remain active. "They are not missing," Jim had told a superintendent back in the 90s. "They are somewhere. You just haven't found the location." That semantic shift, from missing to unlocated, was the engine of his advocacy. It rejected the idea that the children had simply evaporated. It insisted on the laws of physics. Matter occupies space. The children, or their remains, were physical objects that required recovery. Across the city, the major crime investigation branch was quiet, save for the hum of servers. The room was a far cry from the smoke-filled bullpen of 1966. There were no typewriters, no overflowing ashtrays. Instead, there were dual-monitor workstations and a large digital smartboard displaying the timeline of the Beaumont disappearance. Detective Senior Sergeant Miller, a woman with sharp eyes and a background in forensic psychology, was reviewing the digitized sightings database. She was part of the modern cold case unit, a specialized division that hadn't existed when the children vanished. The formation of this unit in 1987 and its subsequent restructuring in the 2000s was a direct biological descendant of the Beaumont case. Before 1966, a missing child was often treated as a runaway until proven otherwise. The quote 269 were often squandered on the assumption of a benign return. Miller clicked on a file. The bakery transaction. The details were granular. A purchase of pasties and a meat pie. A £1 note presented by Jane Beaumont. The shopkeeper's statement was clear. Jane had never bought meat pies before. The children usually bought sweet buns or unmatched shillings worth of goods. The meat pie suggested an adult presence, someone buying lunch, someone giving them the money. The grooming phase, Miller murmured, echoing the theory that had persisted for decades. She cross-referenced the bakery timing with the witness statements from the Collie Reserve. The timeline was tight, too tight for an impulsive act. This was orchestrated.
Miller minimized the window and opened the legislative impact folder. She was preparing a brief for the police academy on historical case management. The Beaumont case was the curriculum. Because of Jane, Anna and Grant, the definition of risk had been rewritten. The South Australian police had overhauled their communication infrastructure. The leisurely pace of 1960s policing, where information travelled at the speed of a typed report carried by a courier, had been replaced by instant data sharing. But the most significant change was the Victims' Advocacy Network. Miller looked at the photo of Nancy Beaumont from a press clipping in the 1980s. Nancy had been the first to articulate the torture of the, quote, 273. It wasn't just the loss, it was the suspension of time. Because of the Beaumonts, the police now had family liaison officers embedded in major investigations from hour one. They had protocols for psychological support. They had Missing Persons Week, a national initiative designed to refresh memories and DNA databases. The computer pinged, an email from the forensic lab regarding the soil samples from Newell Avenue. Subject: Preliminary analysis, Site B. Result: negative for human biological material. Miller closed her eyes for a second. The technology had caught up. They had ground-penetrating radar, DNA phenotyping, isotope analysis of hair samples. They had the tools to catch a ghost, but they still needed the ghost to leave a trace. Nancy Beaumont lived a life defined by a terrible, disciplined privacy. In the decades following the abduction, she had been the face of Australian grief. Every mother in the country had projected their fears onto her. If she smiled in public, she was recovering too fast. If she wept, she was unstable. By the early 2000s, she had withdrawn. She did not give interviews. She did not stand at podiums. Her advocacy had transmuted into endurance. She stayed in the same general area, the same coastline that had taken her children. Her reasoning was a heartbreaking logic. If they escaped, if they grew up and forgot, if they ever came looking, they needed to find me where they left me. She walked through her garden. It was neat, orderly. Control was the only antidote to chaos. She remembered the specific texture of the clothing they wore that day. Jane's shorts, Grant's patterned shirt. She didn't need the police files to recall the thread count or the colour. A car slowed down outside her house. She saw the lens of a camera point through the passenger window. A journalist, likely, looking for a reaction to the dig happening at the factory. Nancy didn't turn away. She didn't hide. She stood still, staring directly at the lens with a flat, unyielding gaze. She denied them the image of a victim. She gave them the image of a witness. The car sped up and drove away. She went back inside and sat at her kitchen table. There was no shrine here, not in the traditional sense, just a house that felt too quiet. She thought about the hoax letters from 1968. The man who had written them was a sociopath, playing games with a mother's heart. But even that cruelty had served a purpose. It had hardened the resolve of the authorities. It had led to new laws regarding the obstruction of justice and the malicious use of telecommunications. Her children had changed the law. They had changed how parents watched their children at the beach. They were no longer just her flesh and blood. They were a boundary marker in the Australian psyche. There was the time before and the time after. The sun was setting over the Newell Avenue excavation site. The floodlights kicked on, bathing the pit in harsh, artificial white light. Superintendent Bray walked down into the hole again. The excavator had reached the undisturbed soil layer, the Pleistocene clay. It was dense, reddish-brown, and absolutely pristine. There had been no hole dug here in 1966. The boys who remembered digging had either been mistaken about the location, or they were remembering a different weekend, a different hole, a different life. Memory was malleable. Clay was not. The anthropologist said, standing up and brushing off his knees. Bray nodded. He felt the weight of the phone in his pocket. He had to make the call to Jim. He had to make the call to Nancy's liaison. He climbed out of the pit and walked toward the command tent. The media were waiting at the fence, their microphones bristling like spears. They wanted a body. They wanted a monster. They wanted an ending. Bray stopped for a moment and looked at the digital map on his tablet. The red circle Vance had drawn 50 years ago was still there. The investigation had moved from intuition to science, from eyesight to radar, but the result was the same silence. He dialed the number. 2 said when the line clicked open. Jim said, "It wasn't a question." "No, Jim, the soil is undisturbed. We've gone down to the geological baseline." There was a long pause on the line, a silence that spanned 5 decades. "All right," Jim said. His voice was steady, reinforced by 50 years of similar disappointments. "What is the next location? What is the next lead?" Bray looked at the board. There were other names, other small discrepancies in the thousands of pages of files. "We're re-examining the potential link to the Riverland sightings, and we're running a new DNA familial match on the unidentified remains found in the Mal roots in 72. "Good," Jim said. "Keep looking. I'm not going anywhere." The line clicked dead. Bray lowered the phone. He looked at his team, young constables, seasoned sergeants, forensic experts. They looked tired. The disappointment was palpable. "Pack it up," Bray ordered. "Secure the site. We brief the media in 20 minutes. He walked into the tent and picked up the binder labelled Legislative Protocols, Missing Persons. The Beaumont case was unsolvable by the standards of 1966. The evidence had been trampled, the timeline muddled, the leads allowed to cool. But the legacy of the case was in this binder. Because of the failures of 1966, there was now a National Missing Persons Coordination Centre. Because of the chaos at Glenelg, crime scenes were now locked down within minutes. Because of the silence that swallowed Jane, Anna and Grant, there was now a roar of data, cameras and alerts that went out the second a child was unaccounted for. Bray ran his hand over the cover of the binder. The investigation would continue. It would move from the field to the lab, from the shovel to the sequencer. He stepped out to face the cameras. The story wasn't over. It had just changed its state of matter. It was no longer a story of 3 children walking to the beach. It was a story of a society that had decided, because of them, that it would never look away again. The parents had ensured that. They had paid for the country's safety with their own purgatory. Bray adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm and clinical. "The excavation at Newell Avenue has concluded. We have not located the Beaumont children. However, the investigation remains open, active, and fully resourced." The cameras flashed, illuminating the dark, empty pit behind him, a hole in the earth that mirrored the hole in the city's heart, deep, empty, and waiting to be filled with the truth. The shutter clicks were a rhythmic, aggressive percussion, a sound that mimicked the ticking of a clock that had been running too long. Bray stood his ground as the barrage of questions followed the flashes, a cacophony of overlapping voices demanding answers he did not have. 290, 291, 292. Bray didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply stepped back from the podium, turning his shoulder to the media pack, effectively ending the engagement. He caught the eye of the media liaison officer, a sharp nod indicating that the show was over. The cordon tape fluttered in the dry, hot wind that swept in from the Gulf, carrying the scent of salt and exhaust fumes, the smell of Adelaide in late summer. He walked back toward the command tent, the heavy, steel-capped boots of his profession kicking up small clouds of dust. The excavation site, moments ago the center of the nation's attention, was already transforming. The forensic anthropologists were packing away their trowels and brushes, tools of a delicate trade that had found nothing but geological strata. The heavy machinery, the excavators that had stood silent and respectful during the hand-digging phase, roared to life. Their engines idled with a throaty rumble, waiting for the order to reverse the work, to put the earth back. It was a cruel mechanics. To dig was an act of hope. To fill was an act of burial. Bray entered the tent, the canvas flapping behind him, cutting off the glare of the sun. Inside, the air was still and warm, smelling of stale coffee and high-stress perspiration. Detective Sergeant Elena Marek was sliding photos into a case file, her movements sharp and frustrated. She looked up as Bray entered, her eyes dark with the same fatigue he felt in his own bones. She asked, not stopping her work. Bray moved to the folding table where the site map was pinned. It was covered in grid lines, coloured dots, and crossed-out sectors. A masterpiece of modern forensic strategy, reduced to a piece of paper documenting a void. Bray said quietly, pouring the dregs of a cold pot of coffee into a styrofoam cup. Marek sighed, finally stopping her hands. She leaned against the trestle table. Bray said, staring at the map. He took a sip of the bitter coffee. Marek nodded, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Bray said, his voice hardening. The drive back to the Major Crime Investigation Branch was a silent procession through the suburbs of Adelaide. Bray drove an unmarked sedan, the air conditioning struggling against the heat radiating off the asphalt. He drove past the manicured lawns, the brick bungalows, the post-war architecture that spoke of the era when the Beaumont children were taken. In 1966, this city was often described as a big country town, a place where doors were left unlocked, where the trust was implicit, woven into the social contract. Jane, Anna and Grant taking a bus to the beach wasn't negligent parenting. It was the standard of the day. That was the knife that twisted in the gut of the public consciousness. They were doing what they were allowed to do, what they were supposed to do. Bray tapped the steering wheel. The failure at Newell Avenue was heavy, but it wasn't the crushing blow it might have been 20 years ago. Modern policing had taught him that negative data was still data. Knowing where they weren't was a step toward knowing where they were, however incremental. He thought about the Riverland sightings he had mentioned to Jim. It was a thread that had been pulled before, but never with modern tweezers. In late 1966, months after the disappearance, a report had come in from a station hand near Wakery. He claimed to have seen a man matching the suspect's sketch, thin face, mid-30s, blonde hair, with 3 children who looked distressingly like the Beaumonts. They were in a dark sedan, parked near a quiet bend of the Murray River. The witness had been dismissed at the time because the sighting was too far out of the geographic profile, and the children were reportedly wearing clothes that didn't match the description of what they were last seen in. But Bray knew what 1966 policing was like. It was localized. It lacked the behavioral science that told modern detectives that abductors often changed victims' clothes to confuse witnesses. It lacked the understanding of the cooling-off period or the mobility provided by the expanding highway network. He turned onto Angus Street, the police headquarters looming ahead. The building was a fortress of glass and concrete, a far cry from the cramped offices of the 60s. He parked and took the elevator up to the cold case section. It was a different atmosphere here. While the rest of the building buzzed with the frenetic energy of active assaults, robberies and fresh homicides, Cold Case was a library of ghosts. It was quiet, deliberate, and intense. The Beaumont Room, officially Conference Room B, but no one called it that, was dedicated entirely to the investigation. The walls were covered in timelines. Photographs of the children, blown up to grainy, haunting proportions, looked down at the detectives. Jane, the responsible eldest, Anna, the middle child, Grant, the little one. Bray threw his jacket over a chair and walked to the whiteboard where current leads were listed. He erased Newell Avenue excavation with a singular, harsh swipe of the felt eraser. The dust of the dry erase marker fell like grey snow. He picked up a red marker and circled Unknown Remains, Mali, 1972. Marek walked in a moment later, carrying a box of files from the car. She set it down with a thud. Lab just emailed, she said. They're prepping the samples from the 72 find. They want to know how deep we want to go with the sequencing. Everything, Bray said, not turning from the board. Mitochondrial, nuclear, YSTR if they can find it. I want phenotyping. I want to know eye color, hair color, ancestry. I want to know if those bones belong to a family tree that has a branch missing in Somerton Park. The remains in question were a fragmented set of bones discovered by a rabbit shooter in the Mali scrub, hundreds of kilometers from the abduction site, 6 years after the event. At the time, a cursory pathology report deemed them likely indigenous, historical, or possibly animal commingled with human. They had been boxed and shelved in the darkest corner of the museum archives until a recent audit flagged them.
"The bone degradation will be severe," Marek warned, playing the devil's advocate, a role she knew Bray needed. Bray countered. He moved to the large table in the centre of the room, dominated by the binder he had held earlier. Legislative protocols. He opened it, but his eyes drifted to the stack of witness statements beside it. Bray murmured. Marek moved to a filing cabinet, the drawers sliding open with the heavy, oiled sound of precision bearings. She fingered through the hanging files until she found the yellowing, brittle paper. She handed it to Bray. He read the typed text, the ink faded to a violet hue. Report, witness sighting, subject, H. Van Dorn, location, Wakery, claims sighted vehicle, possible Holden, with adult male and 3 juveniles. Male digging near bank. Juveniles seemed sedated or sleeping. Witness did not approach. Bray said, "The word hanging in the air." Marek recited from memory. Bray shook his head. Bray said. Marek made a note in her notebook. Bray sat down, finally feeling the weight of the day pressing into his spine. He looked at the picture of the children again. The saturation of the photo was famous. The bright swimsuits, the towel over the shoulder. It was an image of Australian summer innocence that had been retroactively tainted with horror. Bray asked, his voice low. Bray said. He tapped the binder. The phone on the desk rang. It was a jarring digital trill that cut through the analog atmosphere of the room. Bray picked it up. Thorne's voice was crisp, lacking the emotional fatigue that plagued the detectives. He dealt in absolutes, not theories. Thorne said. Bray sat up straighter, his hand tightening on the receiver. Marek stopped writing and watched him, sensing the shift in his posture. Bray's mind raced through the inventory lists from 1966. The clothing descriptions were etched into his brain. Jane was wearing a pink swim piece, but she had shorts over them. Grant was in green swim trunks. Anna, Bray said, reciting the file. Thorne said. Bray said. Bray covered the mouthpiece, looking at Marek. Mimic scrambled for the first world with the most locking the 4. Marek said. Bray said, flipping pages rapidly. She scanned the typed medical notes from the family GP, Dr. C. H. Gribble. Marek read, breathless. Bray uncovered the phone. The silence that filled the room then was heavier than the silence of the excavation pit. It was a silence that screamed. Bray ordered, his voice dropping an octave. Bray hung up. He looked at Marek. She was pale, her hand still resting on the medical file. Quote 365, she whispered. Quote 366, Bray said. He stood up, the fatigue vanishing, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that was both electric and terrifying. Marek stammered. Bray said, grabbing his keys. He walked to the door and stopped and looked back at the board. He looked at the crossed-out quote 372 quote 373 quote, he said. Quote 374 quote 375 quote, Marek said, grabbing her jacket. 376, 377. Bray lied. He wasn't fine. He was vibrating with the terror of potential success. Finding them meant solving the mystery, but it also meant confirming the horror. It meant walking up a driveway to an old man and telling him that the wait was over, but the ending was not the one he had prayed for in the quiet dark of the last 50 years. They moved through the station corridors with purpose. The energy radiating off them turned heads. Other detectives, sensing the shift in the Beaumont team, stepped out of the way. As they reached the car park, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, blood-red shadows across the city. The sky was bruising purple and orange. We need to confirm the button, Bray said as they got into the car. The fracture is compelling, but kids break arms. It's circumstantial. The plastic. If we can link that button to a brand of clothing sold in Adelaide in '66, that's the link. I'll get the archivists on the phone, Marek said, buckling up. We need the Meyer and David Jones catalogues from summer '65 and '66. As the engine roared to life,
Bray looked out at the darkening city. The lights were flickering on in thousands of homes. Families were sitting down to dinner. Parents were checking on sleeping children. For 50 years, the Beaumont children had been suspended in time, wandering the subconscious of the city, forever walking to the beach. "Let's go," Bray said. The car surged forward, leaving the station behind, heading toward the forensics center, toward the science, toward the truth. The shovel was put away. The sequencer and the microscope were now the weapons of choice. The story wasn't over. The state of matter had changed, and for the first time in decades, the silence was about to be broken. The South Australian Forensic Science Centre was a sterile monolith of glass and brushed steel, a stark contrast to the chaotic, dusty reality of the crime scenes it processed. Inside, the air was scrubbed, filtered, and chilled to a constant 19 degrees Celsius. It was a building designed to preserve the truth by arresting decay. Bray and Marek were buzzed through 3 layers of security before reaching Dr. Thorne's lab. The room was bathed in the cool, blue-white glow of LED examination lights. Thorne was hunched over a microscope, while a large monitor on the wall displayed a high-definition, magnified feed of the object on the slide. Thorne didn't look up as the door hissed shut behind them. "Come look at this." Bray stepped closer to the screen. The image was jagged, a landscape of eroded white and grey material. In the center, crusted with microscopic grains of red sand, was the button. Magnified, the damage was evident. The edges were chipped, and the surface was crazed with tiny cracks. But the shape was undeniable. It was a 4-hole button, pearlescent, with a distinct raised rim. "Polyester resin," Thorne said, swiveling his chair around. "Spectrometry confirms it, consistent with mid-60s manufacturing processes. But look at the back." He adjusted the focus knob. The screen blurred, then sharpened on the reverse side of the button. Faint, pressed into the plastic, were tiny letters. They were worn, almost invisible to the naked eye, but under 50 times magnification, they screamed. S. A knit. "South Australian Knitting Mills," Marek breathed. "They were based in Theberton. They closed in the 80s. "I pulled their old supply logs from the digitized business archives," Thorne said, tapping a tablet on his desk. "They supplied buttons and fasteners for school uniforms, workwear and boys' casual shirts. Specifically, the Range line of collared shirts, sold exclusively at department stores in Adelaide between 1964 and 1967. Bray felt a coldness settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Grant's shirt, the one he was carrying. "It gets more specific," Thorne said, his voice dropping. "I ran a batch comparison. This specific diameter, 9 millimeters, and this specific pearlescent finish was used on 2 garments. A girl's cardigan and a boy's short-sleeved patterned shirt. The safari cut." Bray closed his eyes for a second. He could see the police sketch. He could see the black and white photos of the clothes. Grant's shirt had been patterned. Bray asked, opening his eyes. Thorne stood and walked to a separate stainless steel table. A small skeletal fragment lay on a velvet cloth. It looked pitifully small, just a splinter of a life. Thorne said, pointing with a gloved finger. Bray leaned in. He saw the slight bulge in the otherwise smooth curve of the bone. Thorne explained. Bray said, his voice mechanical. Thorne said. He hesitated, looking from Bray to Marek. Marek asked. He started Marek's world. He said, "The song can even find them, Rom?" He said. Thorne 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 said. Thorne. Thorne said. Thorne said. Thorne. Thorne said. 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 Marek asked. He saw the slight bulge in the otherwise smooth curve of the bone. He said. Marek asked. He said. Marek asked. He said. Marek asked. He said. He was raising. He told more reflected. Fawn said, Fawn said, Fawn said, Fawn, Fawn said. Thorn said, Bray finished the thought. The room fell silent again. The evidence was stacking up. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a pile of smoking shell casings. The probability of an unidentified child's bone, found in the South Australian scrub, having a specific healed fracture and being associated with a specific local button from the exact era. The odds of coincidence were astronomical. 408, Bray asked. 409, Thorn said. 410, 411, 411, 411, Fawn said. Bray repeated. 2 days. After 50 years, 2 days felt like a blink and an eternity simultaneously. Bray said, turning to Marek. Marek said softly. Bray said. Bray walked to the window of the lab, looking out at the darkness. He thought of Jim Beaumont, sitting in his house, surrounded by the preserved artifacts of his children's lives. The unread books, the unworn clothes. Marek asked, voicing the question that was tearing at Bray. Bray said firmly. He turned back to Thorn. 422. 423, Thorn promised. Bray checked his watch. 8 p.m. 424. 425, Marek asked. 426, Bray mused. 427. It was a gruesome theory. It was a fit the psychology of the offender they had profiled for decades. A control freak, someone who couldn't let go, someone who needed to possess them even in death. Get some rest, boss, Marek said. She looked worried. Bray knew he looked like a man walking the gallows. I will, Bray said. He wouldn't. He waited until Marek left. Then he walked out into the cool night air. He didn't go to his car. He walked a few blocks to a small park, sitting on a bench under the yellow hum of a street lamp. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to the contact labelled Jim B. His thumb hovered over the call button. The urge to share the burden was overwhelming. To tell the father that his son's arm, the one he had likely signed the cast on, had been found. That the button from the shirt he had likely ironed was sitting under a microscope a few 100 meters away. But he couldn't. The protocols of the binder, the lessons of 1966, demanded rigor. Emotion had no place in the chain of evidence. Bray put the phone away. He looked up at the stars. The Southern Cross hung low in the sky, the same stars that had looked down on Glenelg Beach on Australia Day, 1966. Bray whispered to the empty park. The next morning, the sun rose with a vengeance, promising another day of baking heat. Bray was at his desk by 5:30 a.m., fueled by adrenaline and bad coffee. The office was quiet, the cleaners moving silently with their vacuum cleaners, ghosts in the machine of justice. He was reviewing the topographic maps of the Riverland site. The witness from 1966 had been specific about the location, a bend in the river near a distinctive cluster of gum trees, close to an old pump house. Bray overlaid the 1966 survey map with the modern satellite imagery on his computer screen. The river had moved. The Murray was a living thing, serpentine and shifting. The bank where the man had been seen digging was now 50 meters inland, the water having receded during the drought years and never fully reclaiming the ground. Bray muttered to himself. Marek arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, looking more rested than Bray felt. She carried 2 coffees and a bag of pastries, she said, dropping the bag on his desk. Bray said, standing up. The drive to the Riverland was long, the landscape shifting from the urban sprawl of Adelaide to the rolling vineyards of the Barossa, and then into the flat, harsh scrub of the interior. The red earth stretched out to the horizon, broken only by the grey-green of the saltbush and the occasional skeletal gum tree. It was a landscape that could hide anything. As they drove, they discussed the offender profile. Marek said, watching the road. Bray agreed. Marek said, "They fraud." They arrived at the Wakery site just before 9. The river was a ribbon of opaque brown water, sluggish and wide. The drone team, 2 young officers from the technical support branch, were already setting up. They looked like they were preparing for a moon landing, calibrating sensors and checking battery packs. The lead tech, Constable Lee, greeted him. Lee asked. Bray said. The drone whirred to life, a high-pitched hornet sound that cut through the silence of the bush. It lifted off, shooting straight up into the blue sky, before leveling out and beginning its grid pattern. Bray watched it on the monitor in the back of the tech van. The screen showed the world in false colors. Trees were red bursts of heat. The water was a cool blue. The ground was a tapestry of orange and yellow. Bray pointed. On the LiDAR display, which stripped away the vegetation to show the bare earth, there was a rectangular depression. It was faint, smoothed by 50 years of wind and rain, but the sharp angles of human intervention were still visible to the trained eye. Nature doesn't make straight lines. It's about 6 feet by 3, Lee noted, measuring it on the screen. Depth is hard to say without ground-penetrating radar, but the soil density is definitely lower there. That fits the witness statement, Marek said, her voice tight. Digging near the bank.
But if they were moved to the Mallee, Bray started, his mind working the puzzle, then this hole is empty. It's a dry well. Or, Marek said, it's where they were kept before they were moved, or where something else is buried, evidence, clothes. Mark it, Bray ordered. We can't dig today. We need a warrant and an archaeologist. But this validates the 1966 witness. He wasn't seeing things. He saw a man digging a grave-sized hole days after the children vanished. The validation felt like a victory, albeit a hollow one. It was another piece of the timeline falling into place. Suddenly, Bray's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. It was Thorne. He stepped away from the van, walking toward the river's edge. The water lapped gently at the mud, indifferent to the dark history it had flowed past for decades. Bray. It's Thorne. The amplification finished early. We have a partial profile. Bray stopped breathing. The world narrowed down to the voice in his ear. And? It's a male. We have enough markers to run the familial comparison. Do it. I did, Detective. I ran it against the Beaumont reference sample. There was a pause. The static of the line crackled. There is a 99.98% probability that the remains found in the Mallee belong to a biological child of Jim and Nancy Beaumont. Bray exhaled, a sound that was half sob, half growl. The tension that had held him upright for years seemed to snap, only to be replaced by a rod of iron resolve. You're sure? The science is absolute, Bray. It's Grant. We found him. Bray lowered the phone. He looked at the river. He looked at the sky. He looked at the drone buzzing overhead, searching for ghosts. He turned back to Marek, who was watching him with wide, fearful eyes. She knew. She could see it in his face. He walked over to her. He didn't smile. There was no joy in this. Bray said, his voice steady, reinforced by the truth he now held. She whispered. She said, You find the truth, my considered the impressible animal. She whispered. She said, She no wading them. I find out of the first 2 animal in this world. My find pusheth the place of the roaders, its setting she had conflict. I will have themselves between the melative and the mathit. I wanted understand they work in the grope. She counter themself without home of my joy, Bray. Bray said, It was so exactly when I work. Bray said, My find by well. Bray, she whispered. She find the truth, he word. She said, She was so farve. Bray said, We'll shop the flosing them, she didn't street. The investigation at the first, my find peculiar speech. But she find them. She find, the investigation at the Newell Avenue had been a failure. The press conference had been an apology. But the story hadn't ended there. It had merely gone underground, into the microscopic helices of DNA and the forgotten boxes of the archives. As they packed up the gear, Bray looked at the binder one last time. Legislative protocols.
He closed it. They didn't need protocols now. They needed compassion. They needed to perform the hardest duty of a police officer, to break a heart in order to give it peace. The hole in the city's heart was about to be filled, not with speculation, not with rumors, but with a boy named Grant, who had been waiting in the Mallee scrub for 50 years for someone to come and find him.
Bray got into the car. "Drive," he said. "Jim has waited long enough."